So now we'd like to invite Reverend Kobata to the podium for this morning's Dharma.
From the 17-article Constitution drafted by the then Prince Regent Shotoku Taishi, who encouraged in Article 10, "Let us cease from wrath and refrain from angry looks, nor let us be resentful when others differ from us. For all people have hearts, and each heart has its own leanings. Their right is our wrong, and our right is their wrong. We are not unquestionably sages, nor are they unquestionably fools. Both are simply ordinary human beings. How can one lay down a rule by which to distinguish right from wrong? For we are all, one with another, wise and foolish, like a ring which has no end." Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, 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 Namanda Butsu, Namanda Butsu, Namanda Butsu, Namanda Butsu. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our monthly memorial reflection, gathering, and acknowledgement to our life that exists today because of those who have preceded us. The passage I just read is from this constitution composed by the Prince Shotoku. And for those of you not familiar, here at the Buddhist Church of San Francisco, we have this statue in this far right altar. You're looking at the altar, you're far right. And that's dedicated to Prince Shotoku, who is considered the founder of Japanese Buddhism, because it was during his tenure, I guess we can call it, as the Prince Regent in the 6th century Japan, that he introduced and made the arrangements for Buddhism to be established as a national religion. And scholars have mentioned the reason for Prince Shotoku's interest in bringing Buddhism to Japan was his intention to try to bring harmony to the then very, what he calls, separated, kind of isolated way from the very contentious way that people in that part of the world were existing. It was a very tribal period of Japanese history. And so all the different territories, all the different regions were just constantly trying in conflict with each other. And so it was Shotoku's view and aspiration that from what he had read and understood about the teachings of Buddha, it would bring some sense of cooperation, some sense of harmony and mutual respect and support. And this is what I think is something that today we still need, this sense of finding some basis of bringing us together to help us realize a sense of harmony, mutual respect, and understanding, and cooperation. And recently, I began listening to a series that's called Dharma Realm. Does anyone know what a podcast is? I never knew what exactly a podcast was. And Robert is going to Oshoko now. Okay. Namo Amida Butsu. So, for those not familiar, it's part of the new social media, new way of communicating and so forth. And for your reference, and I hope your, benefit and enjoyment, I would introduce a podcast called Dharma Realm. Dharma realm. Okay, you can go look it up for those of you familiar with podcasts. And this is something produced by Reverend Harry Bridge of the Oakland Buddhist Church, and in conjunction with Professor Dr. Scott Mitchell of the Institute of Buddhist Studies. And they've been doing this series of broadcasts for the last, I understand, 10 years. I didn't know it's been around that long. But whenever, it's not a regular series, you have to go look it up, and then it's whenever they can arrange to put it together. And so they've been doing this series, and as I was going through this list of different topics, I noticed that he had a couple of broadcasts that were addressing what we call social justice in the Buddhist tradition. And this is something I don't know if we necessarily think about too much, but anyway, for their discussion is helping us to get a perspective on our history, our tradition, and how we may be able to look at the different kinds of social issues, social concerns that are part of living in this world. And so this is something that came to mind as I was thinking about the recent situation, concerns about the immigration issues in our society. And with that, I was trying to get some kind of sense of how we can approach this way of understanding and kind of developing a clearer sense of being mutually respectful and aware of the different ways that people look at life. And so this broadcast that I was listening to recently explained, the history of Jodo Shinshu as it developed in Japan as a kind of countercultural way of looking at things. Meaning, in the 12th, 13th century, Buddhism or Japanese society was pretty much a stratified society. There were castes. And same thing with Buddhism as it began. And both Shakyamuni and then Shinran were part of movements to challenge that way of looking at the world, where you start making these kind of distinctions between groups and so forth. So Shinran's approach was to look at it in terms of and this is the basic Pure Land spirit, of the mutuality of all beings, that we are all mutually embraced and we are all equally revered and blessed, you might call it, within the boundless compassion that is Amida Buddha. So all the relative kinds of distinctions that occur in society at the time were not applied. And even within the Buddhist institution, there was kind of an elitist way of looking at the class stations or statuses of the various levels of the established schools of Buddhism at the time. And so Pure Land came in and all of a sudden was introducing this idea that we're all equally endowed with the spirit of the Buddha. And so this is not something that the established traditions or institutions and schools at the time were too appreciative or comfortable with. And so there was an effort to kind of keep this tradition from being introduced. And so as we're aware that Shinran, Honen, and the followers of that Pure Land school were convicted of being anti-social, against society. And so as a result, the situation was that they were either exiled or they were defrocked. But this pure spirit of the openness of the tradition continued to prevail and eventually became part of the established way of understanding and spirituality of Japan. And gradually, though, in another period of Japanese society, as it developed, it became part of the status quo. And so it went along with the medieval period of Japanese history, where Buddhism was considered one of the major institutions, and they kind of went along with it. And then eventually circumstances changed again, and then there was a period after the modern era of Japan in the 1800s where there was a movement to remove Buddhism from Japanese society and return to the original Shinto indigenous religion. But again, there was a struggle. But once again, after things were worked out, the institution decided to become part again of the status quo. And as a result, they became part of that imperialist period of Japanese history. But anyway, taking that general, very brief overview, bringing us here to America. When our tradition was introduced to this country, it was not accepted openly. And in fact, it's clearly, and Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams in his book American Sutra points out how Buddhism was considered an alien religion. And that's why, as you're probably aware, our priests were specifically identified as potential threats to this country. And so they were amongst the first to be rounded up and placed into the internment camps. And then there's this discussion about how this impacted us, those of us who were the descendants, and some of you were actually part of that whole movement. And as a result, that kind of caused some kind of apprehension, this uneasiness about how to interact with this culture, with this society under those circumstances. And so to some extent, there was kind of what they call the shikataganai attitude. The idea that there's nothing you can do, so you more or less become complacent with that situation and do the best you can and try to figure out what to do later. But at the same time, we do know for a fact that there were individuals like the Kashiwagis who did challenge, who did protest, and there were people that we've learned who did challenge the constitutionality of that action by American politics. And so that brings us to the present and thinking about how we conduct our own affairs within our Sangha, let alone society as a whole. But I think we're starting to sense a sense of responsibility for the way we are participating with each other here in this community and the society at large. And this is part of the development, the growth, the sensitivity that we can bring to not only our community here, but to society as a whole, to be able to have this insight into life of a basic sense of the mutual responsibility we have to each other and not excluding and setting up standards for which we'll embrace or reject, but to really come to what we could call the spirit of compassion. Not that we can necessarily do it at all the time, but at least be aware of the limited perspectives that we bring to our own lives and those we interact with. But at the same time within it, we are ranging to appreciate or realizing a way of opening our hearts and minds to recognize the limitations that we all have in interacting. But it is in that kind of awareness that we begin to sense a deeper awareness of the fact that we do not live alone, that we do in fact live interdependently and thereby mutually responsible for what goes on in our own lives and the lives of all those we are living with. And so these are the kinds of perspectives that I feel that we could say is part of our awareness. So creating a sangha is not just to maintain an organization. Creating a sangha is to be able to realize our own limited abilities, but at the same time recognizing we are all here to support each other because we cannot exist alone, because we cannot live as we are without the support of others. So anyway, I'm kind of looking around to figure out how the spirit of compassion can become a real basis for our living this life, and how the wisdom, the light of the Dharma can bring us to a deeper sense and appreciation of the fact that we do not exist alone. And with that, to be open to recognizing the uniquenesses of everyone. There is no one that can live for our own, on their own. And so this is the way that I would hope that we recognize this and continue to move on to develop this spirit, to realize it and share it. So this is how we would address these social issues and concerns that continue to challenge our understanding and appreciation of life. And recognizing that I really don't know, and I can't say for some other person how they should or shouldn't live necessarily, unless I can presume to have the enlightenment of a Buddha, to be able to make that determination. So that's why, we use this expression to remember that we're Buddhists, not Buddhas. So in a sense, to recognize we are aspiring to open up our hearts and minds and to be able to realize this sense of boundless wisdom, compassion that is the essential sense of our being. And this sense of being alive within that experience, awareness of this unconditional compassion that is the heart of the Buddha Dharma. And it embraces us, and within that receives us into the world or the ocean of immeasurable light and life. So like limited ripples and waves, we come to move into this ocean and thereby realize the boundless life, immeasurable life that we're all a part of. And it is that sense that in one passage, Shinran offers the insight and encouragement. I know nothing at all of good or evil, for if I could know thoroughly, as Amida Tathagata knows, that an act was good, then I would know good. If I could know thoroughly, as the Tathagata knows, that an act was evil, then I would know evil. But with a foolish being filled with blind passions in this burning, fleeting world, the burning house, all matters, without exception, are empty and false, totally without truth and sincerity. The Nembutsu alone is true and real. So, to avoid any pretense of knowing what is good or evil and imposing it on others, we are encouraged to rely on Amida Tathagata as the boundless compassion and wisdom that will hopefully and meaningfully, thoroughly transform the darkness of ignorance into enlightenment, suffering to joy, conflicts to peace, complaints to gratitude. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.